Good morning. It is Thursday, January the 27th, and this is The Drill. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the daily declaration for spiritual warfare, there will be no free lunch, and the next chapter in the book, How We Got Here, the 70s, called Let's Talk About Me. All that and more when I get back. Thank you. And now the daily declaration for spiritual warfare for January the 27th. You will see visions and dream dreams from me. My child, I reveal myself to my servants in visions. And I speak to them in dreams. Just as I gave my knowledge and understanding to Daniel and his friends, I will fill you with my knowledge and understanding. Just as Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds, so too, if you serve me with all your heart, will I give you understanding of visions and dreams from me. When I give you my visions and dreams, pay close attention to all I say, for you too have been brought to this moment for a very special purpose. Acts chapter 2, verses 17 through 18, Daniel chapter 1, verse 17, Ezekiel chapter 40, verses 1 through 4. Prayer declaration. Lord, I do not fear the darkness of night, for I wait expectantly for your visions and dreams to fill me with understanding and knowledge for your people. You awaken me morning by morning, and you awaken my ear to hear as the learned hear. You show forth your salvation in my life from day to day. Let your angels guard and protect me at night, and I will show forth your glory every day. And that was the declaration for spiritual warfare for Thursday, January the 27th. Who is the true conservative? The true conservative is the person that understands that conservatism is not just about politics, but culture as well. He's the person that knows that there is no leadership in a constitutional republic. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American. Thank you, thank you. And now there's no free lunch. We need to begin to make a way forward about the fundamental things most human beings are agreed about when it comes to the human person. If you interviewed 100 people and asked them one question, do you believe that human life has intrinsic dignity? I bet you would get nearly universal agreement to that question. And if you could expand on that question to other shared visions about what a human being is for, what the purpose of work is, what opportunity should look like, and why people should have those opportunities, then together we might be able to stop thinking about this construction, economic man, and instead think about our purpose and what we're for beyond avoiding work, beyond consumption, beyond doing things that only last for today. Victor Clark. I can think of no better way to conclude this section. Human flourishing is not about a man of transactions, the mere allocation of scarce resources. When we accept the dignity of mankind as the foundation of our adventure, we begin to ask the right questions and pursue deeper answers that satisfy the longings of our soul. And that was, there's no free lunch. Thank you, thank you. Ineffable Creator, who out of the treasures of thy wisdom has appointed 3 hierarchies of angels and set them in admirable order high above the heavens, and has disposed the divers portion of the universe in such marvelous array. Thou who art called the true source of light and supereminent principle of wisdom, be pleased to cast a beam of thy radiance upon the darkness of my mind and dispel me from the double darkness of sin and ignorance in which I have been born. Thou who makest eloquent the tongues of little children, fashion my words and pour upon my lips the grace of thy benediction. Grant me penetration to understand, capacity to retain, method and facility in study, subtlety in interpretation, and abundant grace of expression. Order the beginning, direct the progress, and perfect the achievement of my work. Thou who art true God and man, and livest and reignest forever and ever. Amen. Thank you, thank you. Let's talk about me. Believe it or not, there was a time when Americans thought of themselves and were thought of by others as a taciturn people. The Puritan heritage and the rigors of frontier life had instilled in Americans a mistrust of garrulity, of blatherskate, of fibberty-gibbet. Speak not but what may benefit yourself or others. Avoid trifling conversations, urged Benjamin Franklin in his autobiography. And even into the mid-20th century, Americans wanted to think of their heroes as men of few words, like Gary Cooper or John Wayne. But the public display of one's suffering, one's wrongs, one's pitiableness, one's misfortunes, which would have seemed shameful, ignoble, even disgusting before World War II, became in the 1970s the distinctive American national style. Don't bottle it up. You have a right to tell others how you feel. It was, said the author Tom Wolfe, the undeclared motto of the 1970s, let's talk about me. On April 10, 1975, Betty Ford, the First Lady of the United States, entered Long Beach Naval Hospital. The First Lady's spokesman confessed that Mrs. Ford was to be treated for drug addiction. 2 weeks later, Mrs. Ford volunteered that she was an alcoholic as well. These were personal and private secrets of a sort that Americans had once desperately concealed, and publicly acknowledging them took considerable courage. Betty Ford may have suspected she had no choice. Her secrets were in danger of being spilled by a newly uninhibited press. But she also seems to have believed she was rendering a public service by rescuing addiction from the dark obscurity to which it had been superstitiously consigned as cancer and mental illness had been rescued before it. The First Lady's frankness taught millions of people that addiction can be successfully treated, but that success requires the addict and family to abandon their face-saving lies and confront the truth. This was a lesson that Americans badly needed to learn in the coke-snorting 1970s. Unfortunately, they learned it only too well. A dozen years before, Jacqueline Kennedy had dazzled the Washington press with the discretion and delicacy which she coped with her husband's womanizing. 20 years before that, Eleanor Roosevelt had bitterly closed her well-bred mouth on the news that her old rival, Lucy Mercer, had been visiting with President Roosevelt on the day of his death. But Mrs. Ford apparently believed that there was no disclosure too embarrassing to lay before the American public. And the public agreed. She became the most popular First Lady since Mrs. Kennedy, hailed and applauded for her courage and honesty. It's true that the old wall of discretion had begun to crumble well before the 1970s, thanks in very large part to the profession of psychiatry. Freudian psychoanalysis had arrived in the United States before World War I, and the exodus of German and Austrian Jews in the 1930s landed on these shores representatives of every psychiatric clique, sect, and heresy. Freudianism reached its apogee of prestige in this country in the 1950s, when a psychiatrist played by Ingrid Bergman could, without anybody laughing or coughing, solve a crime in Alfred Hitchcock's 1946 Spellbound by interpreting dreams, and when clinical psychological terms and the new coinages of Freudianism, paranoia, repression, transference, flooded middle-class speech. Still, the cost and lengthiness and verbalism of the Freudian system guaranteed that psychoanalysis would remain very much a minority practice. In the 1970s, psychotherapy was at last democratized. New and cheaper methods of treatment were developed. Blue Cross, employer health plans, and Medicaid were enlarged to include mental health coverage, and a tsunami of psychological books, articles, lectures, and television appearances broke upon the nation. The Westside Los Angeles telephone book for February 1970 discloses 135 psychologists' office. By February 1980, there were 233. A psychologist became the lead character of a situation comedy, The Bob Newhart Show. With this professional help, Americans in the 1970s began talking their heads off. Let it all hang out had been the 1960s slogan of the half-consciously countercultural. Half a decade later, every Buick owner in the country understood how very dangerous it was to keep his feelings bottled up. Back in a minute. Thank you. Classic Freudianism, for all its hostility to religion and traditional ideas of morality, nevertheless remained very much a doctrine of the respectable bourgeoisie. Freud suspected that some nasty impulses lurked in the unconscious mind, and he believed that the ultimate goal of therapy was to subdue these impulses and reassert the supremacy of reason and self-control in the individual's life. Freudianism originated in the lands of Kafka and Wagner, of the Brothers Grimm and the 30 Years' War. Whatever their other failings, strict Freudians were in no danger of being conned into an excessively optimistic view of human nature. But as psychotherapy was Americanized and even more Californianized, all those dark Central European anxieties were dismissed as outdated gloom. The mind did not resemble Dracula's castle, with horrors unimaginable chained in its dungeons. It was like a Santa Monica sea house, whose windows had become a little grimy. Polish them up, let the outside in and the inside out, and the owners will once again enjoy the sunlight, the ocean zephyrs, and the aroma of orange blossoms. What these popular psychologists taught, and what the American reading public snapped up by the millions in paper book editions, was a heady creed. They unabashedly asserted the absolute priority of oneself and one's desires. If we can learn to love and nurture ourselves, opined the authors of How to Be Your Own Best Friend, we will find ourselves richer than we ever imagined. The amazingly astute title of that book was taken from what one of the authors regarded as a great moment in his career of psychotherapy. Counseling a grieving man, the psychologist said, "You look as if you lost your best friend." He said, "Well, I have." And I said, "Don't you know who your best friend is?" He thought for a moment, and tears came into his eyes. Then he said, "I guess it's true. You are your own best friend." One of the decade's most successful self-help books, Your Erroneous Zones, sold 4 million copies between its publication in 1976 and the end of the decade. The author, Wayne Dyer, furiously attacked even the most minimal obligations of ordinary courtesy, which he termed masturbation, the shoulds that crimp the free spirit. Contemporary America was oppressed, Dyer wrote, by the rule that you must go to a wedding or send a gift even if you don't like them. You just don't ignore invitations even when you want to. You may feel resentful about buying the gift, but go through the motions anyhow because that's the way things are supposed to be done. Conversely, attending funerals that you'd rather not go to because you're supposed to. You must attend such formal functions to show that you grieve or respect or have the appropriate emotions. Dyer, as this quotation suggests, rejected conventional grammar as thoroughly as he repudiated conventional etiquette. Only you can decide what's right for you. In February 1980, when the Marine Corps discharged a woman sergeant for posing nude in Playboy, the magazine issued a statement saying, "We are stunned by the military's response. All the women who took part in the pictorial made it clear they were proud of their military service. They were proud of their service. What business had the stuffy old Marines to object?" Sergeant Bambi Lynn Finney was, after all, only taking to heart the advice of effectiveness training for women, a handbook published in 1979 to accompany a popular series of courses that one of the basic ways to meet personal needs and bring about changes is through self-disclosure. A psychologist named Penelope Rushinoff barged her way to fame as the country's leading teacher of assertiveness to women. For $150, she led her students through 10 weeks of drills and workshops that guided them to put their needs first. A graduate of the course, a painter, described what it did for her. One occasion stands out. It sounds silly, but it was important. I moved my studio from a small room, the dining room, to the biggest room in the house. I took over the center of the entire place. I have to see my paintings from everywhere, from every viewpoint. They have to be the focal point so I can judge them and experience them. Before I was married, my workspace was at the center of my living quarters. But when I got married, the main room became the living room. It seemed the acceptable thing. But I gradually knew I had to take over the living room. I agonized silently for months about it before making the switch. Then suddenly one day I did it. I got a friend to help me. I had to move all the furniture, even the piano. When my children and my husband came home, it was all done. They had to accept it. There were some hard moments, but I knew I needed it. It was my life and my work at stake. True, the marriage ended in divorce, but no techniques can solve all one's problems. PBS persuaded a California family, wonderfully named Loud, to permit the network to install a camera in their home and film everything that happened there. The highlights were edited into a 12-part series called An American Family and broadcast in the fall of 1973. In 1978, William Morrow issued Mommy Dearest, in which the adopted daughter of the movie star Joan Crawford exposed every one of her mother's cruelties and vices to public view. More elegantly, the son of Harold Nicholson and Vita Sackville West published his Portrait of a Marriage in 1973, bearing the homosexuality and mutual adultery of a couple who had once been best known for their literary accomplishments, their beautiful garden, and their diplomatic service to England. Not so long ago, it was considered highly improper for former cabinet members to publish memoirs about their time in office. Dean Acheson waited for almost 20 years before publishing Present at the Creation, and even then made a point of never quoting President Truman directly. Of the 23 men and women to serve in President Eisenhower's cabinets, only one, Agricultural Secretary Ezra Taft Benson, published a memoir, and it was discreet to the point of tedium. Of the 30 men and women to serve in President Reagan's cabinet, a dozen published, as did his chief speechwriter. his first economic policy advisor, and 2 of his budget directors. And it was only a handful of these writers who didn't have some cruel or hurtful story to tell about the president that they had served. Back in a minute. Thank you. It was a new American style. Phil Donahue's Dayton, Ohio talk show migrated to Chicago in 1969 and entered national syndication in 1970. It introduced a whole new genre of programming to tens of millions of viewers. Day after day, ordinary Americans caught in problems, both ordinary and not so ordinary, confessed the most minute and humiliating details of their lives to Phil and his studio audience. Drunkenness and wife-beating, transvestism and credit card debt, incest and obesity. Before Donahue, the entertainer who offered the public a prurient spectacle who had felt compelled to adopt a stance of outraged morality. The direct ancestor of the Donahue show had been the breach of promise trials of the 19th century. In front of an enthralled town, a weeping pregnant girl accused a young man of having lied to her about marriage. The young man would defend himself by arguing that the girl was no unblemished virgin. The Walter Winchells of the radio age continued that tradition. They were angered, appalled, shocked by the juicy story they were about to unveil. Phil Donahue's innovation was to dispense with the old humbug and substitute a new humbug of his own, the non-judgmental hearing, with the studio audience as a combination of jury and dispenser of absolution. Donahue taught all his audiences in the studio and at home to react to the squalid, the disgraceful, the immoral exactly the way he did, with an attentive ear and a sympathetic nod of the head. Along the way, he taught his audiences to talk the way his guests did, without any tincture of hesitation, reserve, or modesty. By 1979, 39% of all Americans and close to 60% of educated young Americans agreed that people should be free to look, dress, and live the way they want, whether others like it or not. Edgar Hoover, a notorious judger of values, had famously fired an FBI agent he spotted with a copy of Playboy under his arm. In July 1979, FBI Director William Webster formally terminated virtually all supervision of the private lives of his agents. We are trying to stay out of people's private lives unless their conduct, and the emphasis is always on conduct, not personal beliefs, impacts the effectiveness of that individual and the Bureau. If even the FBI felt it could no longer draw value judgments, the non-judgmental millennium had truly arrived. Among the harbingers of that millennium were Vince Matthews of New York City and Wayne Collett of Santa Monica, California, the gold and silver medalists in the 400-meter run at the 1972 Olympic Games. On the winner's platform, the two men slouched and chatted throughout the Star-Spangled Banner. As Matthews stepped down, he twirled his medal around his finger. 4 years before in Mexico City, the U.S. team's black sprinters had bowed their heads and struck the clenched fist salute during the medal ceremony. Upsetting as it was to many at home during that season of riots and assassinations, the 1968 incident made a serious point in a dignified way. But Matthews and Collett had nothing to say. They were rebels, not only without causes, but without content. The endless self-expression of the 1970s was uttered in a strangely inexpressive new idiom, a halting language of semi-digested bits of psychological theory, relationships, centering, neuroses, and salvaged fragments of drug user slang, all uttered in the stammering inarticulation affected by the student radicals of the 1960s. One wonders whether a large part of the appeal of the you-knows and kind-ofs and I'm likes that settled on American speech like a blanket of dust clogging the gears of a once clean machine was that Americans retained some residual awareness of the shamefulness of the thoughts they were expressing. To come right out and say that one is leaving one's wife because she's no longer as pretty as she was requires a more candid hard-heartedness than most men can sum it up. Better, much better, to scuttle backward, covering one's retreat with meaningless broken shards of jargon, separated by grunts, ums, and ah-ah-ahs. And that was the latest part of the book, as the latest part of the book called How We Got Here, the 70s. And it's that particular chapter is called Let's Talk About Me. Thank you, thank you. And this is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you to be honest, to be smart, to be beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.